What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Hello, brave souls. Today I've got a story for you about a priest struggling with his faith prior to the zombie apocalypse and then working through that as the zombie apocalypse happens. So I hope you guys enjoy the story. It's called The Last Prayer. Father Michael Brennan knelt before the altar of St. Augustine's, his knees grinding against the worn stone that had supported countless prayers over the decades. The candles flickered in their brass holders, casting dancing shadows across the crucifix that seemed to mock him with its silent presence. Outside, the October wind rattled with stained glass windows, each gust a whispered reminder of his doubt. "Show me," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast emptiness of the church. "Give me a sign that you're still there." The silence stretched on, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. Michael had been having this conversation with God, or with the void, for months now. Ever since little Emma Reeves had died of leukemia, despite the fervent prayers of her family and half the congregation. Ever since his own mother had withered away in their sterile hospital room, calling his name with her last breath while he held her hand and felt nothing but the terrible weight of absence. 43 years old, 20 of them in the service to the church, and Michael Brennan was losing his faith like water through cupped hands. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting the movement. The church felt cavernous around him, too large for the dwindling congregation that gathered here each Sunday. Salem's Crossing had been dying a slow death for years, hemorrhaging young people to the cities and leaving behind only the stubborn, elderly, and the economically trapped. The parish council had been making noises about consolidation, about closing St. Augustine's and merging with St. Mary's over in Millfield. The thought of it made Michael's stomach clench with something that might have been grief, if he could still feel such things properly. The heavy oak doors groaned open behind him, and Michael turned to see Harold Wickham shuffling in from the night. Harold was one of the constants, 78 years old, arthritic hands that shook when he lit his votive candles, but never missed a day. He came in every evening at 9:30, rain or shine, to light a candle for his dead wife, Margaret. "Evening, Father," Harold said, his voice a papery whisper in the silence. "Harold?" Michael managed a tired smile. "How are you holding up?" The old man shrugged, already making his way to the bank of votive candles along the south wall. "Day by day, you know. Day by day." Michael watched him go through the ritual, the careful selection of a fresh candle, the trembling hands that he touched to the wick of the flame of another. It was beautiful in a way, this faith worn smooth by decades of practice. Harold never questioned, never doubted. He simply believed, as naturally as breathing. Michael envied him that certainty. "Father?" Harold's voice called from the shadows. "You all right? You look tired." "Just thinking," Michael replied. "Don't mind me." But Harold was studying him with the sharp eyes that bellied his frail appearance. "You know, Margaret used to tell me that faith wasn't about never having questions. It was about asking them anyway and trusting that the answers would come to you when needed them most." The words hung in the air between them like incense. Michael felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, but its faint echo. "She was a wise woman," Michael said. "That she was." Harold finished his prayer and turned to go. "Don't stay too late, Father. Even God rests sometimes." After the old man left, Michael stood alone again in the flickering candlelight. He pulled out his cell phone to check the time. Almost 10 o'clock. He should lock up, go back to the rectory, try to sleep. Instead, he found himself scrolling through news headlines, a habit that had become compulsive over the past few months. The world was full of darkness, wars, climate disasters, political hatred, random violence. Where was God in any of it? The first headline that caught his attention was local. Multiple animal attacks reported in western Massachusetts. He clicked through to read about the dogs and cats found dead, their bodies showing signs of savage bites. The authorities were warning pet owners to keep their animals indoors. Probably coyotes, the article suggested, though the pattern of wounds was unusual. Michael was about to close the browser when another headline appeared. CDC investigation unusual illness in Vermont town. This one was more concerning. Dozens of people hospitalized with fever, delirium, and violent behavior. The article was vague, mentioning only that the patients seemed unresponsive to normal treatment and that several had attacked medical staff. A chill ran down Michael's spine that had nothing to do with the October wind. He closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket, but the unease remained. Outside, Salem's Crossing slept under a canopy of stars. Michael locked the church doors and walked a short path to the rectory, its footsteps echoing off the empty street. The town had always been quiet, but tonight it felt different. Expectant, somehow. Like the silence before a storm. He was fishing for his keys when he heard it. A low moan, coming from the direction of the cemetery behind the church. Michael froze, listening. There it was again. A sound of pain or distress that made his priestly instincts kick in despite his spiritual malaise. "Hello?" he called softly. "Is someone there?" The moaning stopped. Michael waited, straining his ears, but heard only the rustle of dead leaves. Probably an animal, he told himself. A wounded deer, maybe. But his feet carried him around the side of the church anyway, toward the wrought iron gate that separated the yard from the cemetery. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the weathered headstones standing like broken teeth in the silvery grass. Michael pushed through the gate, which gave a protesting squeal that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is anybody hurt?" he called again. Movement caught his eye near the back of the cemetery, by the old section where the stones dated back to the 1800s. A figure was hunched over one of the graves, its back to Michael. Relief flooded through him. Someone visiting a loved one, overcome with grief. He'd seen it before. "Excuse me," Michael said, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" The figure straightened slowly and turned toward him. In the moonlight, Michael could make out what had once been a woman, elderly, wearing a faded floral dress that he recognized. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, who had died just 3 days ago, who should be lying on the ground beneath 6 feet of earth. But Eleanor Hastings was standing in front of her own grave, and the front of her dress was dark with what looked like soil and something else. Something wet. Her eyes were clouded white in the moonlight, and when she opened her mouth, that terrible moaning sound emerged again. Michael's mind rejected what he was seeing. It was impossible. A hallucination brought on by stress and doubt. Eleanor Hastings was dead. He had performed her funeral service himself, had watched her casket lowered into the ground. Eleanor took a shambling step toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural. And that was when Michael saw the earth around her grave had been disturbed. Not dug up from above, but pushed up from below. Clods of dirt and fragments of wood that might have been coffin pieces lay scattered around the site. "Eleanor?" Michael's voice came as a whisper. She moaned again and lurched forward, her arms reaching out toward him. Michael saw her fingernails, or what was left of them, were caked with earth and torn down to the quick. She had clawed her way out of her own grave. Instinct finally overcame shock, and Michael stumbled backwards. His heel caught on a low headstone and he went down hard, his palms scraping against rough granite. Eleanor continued her shambling approach, and in the moonlight, Michael could see that her lips and chin were stained dark with something that wasn't soil. He scrambled to his feet and ran. The rectory door slammed behind him as Michael threw the deadbolt and leaned back against the wood, his heart hammering. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. People didn't just rise from the grave. Not like this. Not as mindless things driven by hunger. But even as his rational mind struggled to process what he'd been seeing, his phone was buzzing with an incoming call. The display showed Sheriff Martinez. "Father Brennan!" The sheriff's voice was tight with stress. "Thank God you're answering. We've got a situation developing, and I need you to stay inside and lock your doors." "What kind of situation?" Michael asked, though part of him already knew. "We've got reports of... I don't know how to say this. People attacking others. Violent attacks. Some of the attackers..." Martinez paused. "Some of them are people who should be dead, Father. People we buried weeks ago." Michael sank into the kitchen chair. The phone pressed to his ears. "I saw Eleanor Hastings in the cemetery." "Jesus Christ." A pause. "Sorry, Father. But this is happening all over town. We've got Molly Pritchard attacking her own grandson, and she's been dead for a month. The Kowalski twins, dead in that car crash last spring. They're walking around downtown, and they're biting people, Father. Tearing into them like animals." Through the kitchen window, Michael could see lights coming in the house across the street. People were waking up to a nightmare. "What do you want me to do?" Michael asked. "Stay put. We're setting up an emergency shelter at the high school, but right now it's not safe to move around. I've got 3 deputies dead already, and..." The line crackled with static. They went dead. Michael tried calling back, but got no answer. He tried 911 and got a busy signal. His hands were shaking as he set the phone down and tried to think. The dead were rising. The actual dead. Climbing out of their graves and hunting the living. It was biblical. Apocalyptic in the most literal sense. And it was happening in Salem's Crossing, Massachusetts, on a Tuesday night in October. For the first time in months, Father Michael Brennan found himself praying not only out of habit or duty, but out of desperate need. "Lord," he whispered, "if this is the end times, help me understand what you want from me. Help me know what to do." A crash from outside made him jump. Through the front window, he could see a crowd gathering in the street, but not a normal crowd. These people moved wrong, shambling and lurched with that same unnatural gait he'd seen from Eleanor Hastings. And they were converging on the Hendersons' house across the street, where lights had just come on. Michael watched in horror as the dead began pounding on the Hendersons' doors. Jerry Henderson appeared at an upstairs window, cell phone pressed to his ear, his face pale with terror. His wife Sarah appeared beside him, holding their 8-year-old daughter Chloe. The front door splintered. Michael was moving before he consciously decided to act. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept in the hall closet, a relic from his high school days that he'd never quite thrown away, and headed for the door. His hands were steady now, his mind clear in a way it hadn't been for months. The Henderson family needed help. His parishioners, his flock, were in danger. Whatever crisis of faith he'd been struggling with seemed small and self-indulgent compared to the immediate need in front of him. He stepped out into the night and immediately understood the scope of the catastrophe. The entire street was full of them, the walking dead, shambling between houses, breaking down doors, pursuing the living with single-minded hunger. The air was filled with screams and the sound of splintering wood. Michael ran across the street, hefting the baseball bat. The first one that turned toward him had been Bill Kowalski, dead these past 3 months in a car accident. Half of Bill's face was gone, but he moved toward Michael with reaching arms and gnashing teeth. Michael swung the bat with all his strength, connecting with Bill's skull with a wet crack that would have sickened him under normal circumstances. Bill went down and stayed down. Michael felt a moment of guilt. He had just destroyed what had been once a human being, but it passed quickly. Whatever Bill Kowalski had been, this thing wasn't him anymore. The front door of the Henderson house hung open, torn from its hinges. Michael could hear screaming from inside. Sarah's voice, shrill with terror. He pushed through the doorway and found chaos. 3 of the dead had cornered the family in the living room. Jerry was swinging a fireplace poker wildly, trying to keep them back while Sarah clutched Chloe behind him. One of the attackers was Eleanor Hastings. She must have followed him from the cemetery. The other 2 were strangers to Michael, probably from the newer section of town. Michael waded in with the bat, taking down Eleanor first with a blow that dropped her permanently. The second one turned toward him, a man in his 50s with a ragged bite mark on his neck that was still oozing dark blood. and Michael put him down too. The third one, a young woman in a torn wedding dress, was faster than the others. She lunged at Michael with surprising speed, her teeth snapping inches from his throat. Jerry's poker caught her in the side of the head with a metallic clang, and she staggered. Michael finished her with the bat. In the sudden silence, the family huddled together, all three of them staring at Michael with wide, shocked eyes. "Thank you," Jerry whispered. "Oh God, thank you, Father." "We need to get out of here," Michael said, glancing back toward the broken door. "More are going to come." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely under control. "They're everywhere." Michael thought quickly. The church was solid stone construction, with heavy doors and narrow windows. It could be defended if necessary. And if this was truly the end of times, there was a certain rightness to making their stand in the house of God. "St. Augustine's," he said. "We can gather survivors there and wait for help." They made their way through the chaos-filled streets, Michael leading with the bat, Jerry bringing up the rear with his poker. Other survivors joined them along the way. Old Mrs. Chen from the corner house, dragging her oxygen tank. The Brennan family, no relation to Michael, with their twin toddlers. Tom Vasquez, who ran the hardware store and had armed himself with a crowbar. By the time they reached the church, their group had grown to nearly 20 people. Michael fumbled with the keys at the front door while keeping an eye on the street, where shapes moved in the darkness like a plague of shadows. Inside, the church felt like sanctuary in the truest sense. The thick stone walls muffled the sounds of chaos from outside, and the familiar smell of incense and old wood was comforting. Michael lit the altar candles and several of the larger votive candles, filling the space with warm, flickering light. "Everyone stay together," he told the group. "We'll make our stand here until help arrives." But as the night wore on, it became clear that help might not be coming. Tom Vasquez had a police scanner, and the reports coming through painted a picture of total societal collapse. Not just Salem's Crossing, but towns across New England were reporting the same phenomenon. The dead were rising everywhere, and civilization was crumbling under the assault. Michael found himself thrust into a leadership role he'd never wanted. People looked to him for answers, for comfort, for hope. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. As he ministered to the frightened survivors, holding crying children, praying with the elderly, organizing defense against the undead who periodically tested the church's doors and windows, Michael felt his faith returning. Not the comfortable, unquestioned faith of his youth, but something harder and more real. A faith forged in crisis, tempered by genuine need. These people needed him, and through serving them, he found his way back to God. On the third day, as they huddled in the church with their dwindling supplies, young Chloe Henderson tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Father Mike," she whispered, "why did God let the dead people come back?" It was the question they were all thinking. The theological challenge that would have sent Michael into a spiral of doubt just a week before. Now, he knelt down to meet the child's eyes and found that he had an answer. "I don't know, Chloe," he said honestly, "but I know that he's still with us, even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times. God is with us, and that means we don't face the darkness alone." She seemed satisfied with that answer, and curled up against his side as he continued his vigil by the window. Outside, the dead wandered through the streets of Salem's Crossing, but inside the church, the living held fast to hope. Michael's phone had been dead for hours, but Tom's scanner still crackled with occasional transmissions. Most were automatic emergency broadcasts, but sometimes they caught fragments of human voices. Other survivors, other communities still fighting. They weren't alone in this world. On the fourth day, Harold Wickham died. The old man had been declining since the first night. His arthritis medication long since exhausted. He went peacefully in his sleep, and Michael performed the last rites with a heavy heart. They had no way to bury him properly, no way to ensure he wouldn't rise again like the others. "We have to." Jerry Henderson couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. They couldn't risk Harold coming back. Michael nodded grimly. "I'll do it." But as he knelt beside Harold's still form with a knife borrowed from Tom's toolbox, something stopped him. Call it instinct, call it faith. But Michael found himself placing his hand on Harold's forehead instead. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "if this is truly the end times, if death itself has been perverted by some great evil, then I ask you to keep this good man's soul safe. Don't let him be corrupted by whatever force animates the others. Let Harold Wickham rest in peace." He waited, his hands still on Harold's forehead, half expecting nothing to happen. But then he felt it, a warmth spreading through his palm, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since before his crisis of faith began. Hours passed. Harold's body remained still and peaceful. He did not rise. Word of what had happened spread through their small group like wildfire. Some called it a miracle. Others remained skeptical. But Michael knew what he had felt. And more importantly, he knew what it meant. God was still there, still active in the world, especially in, its darkest day. The dead might rise, but they were not beyond God's power to grant peace. Over the days that followed, Michael performed the same ritual over 2 more bodies. Mrs. Chen, who had succumbed to her emphysema, and one of the Brennan twins, who had been bitten during a failed attempt to reach the grocery store. Each time, he felt that same warmth, that same sense of divine presence. And each time, the dead stayed dead. It was on the 7th day that the helicopters appeared. Military choppers, flying in formation over the town. The survivors rushed outside despite the danger, waving shirts and shouting. One of the helicopters peeled off from the formation and circled the church, its loudspeaker crackling to life. "Survivors of the church, this is the Massachusetts National Guard. We are establishing safe zones in Springfield and Worcester. Prepare for evacuation." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The soldiers who rappelled down from the hovering chopper were efficient and professional. But Michael could see the strain in their eyes. They'd seen too much, lost too many. This was bigger than just New England. It was global. "You did good work here, Father," the lieutenant in charge told Michael as they prepared to load the survivors onto transport helicopters. "Keeping these people alive, keeping them together. That took real leadership." Michael looked back at St. Augustine's, at the church they had sheltered through the worst week of their lives. "I was just doing my job." "No," the lieutenant said quietly. "You were doing more than that. In times like these, faith matters. Hope matters. You gave these people both." As the helicopter lifted off, carrying the survivors toward whatever uncertain future awaited them, Michael pressed his face to the window for one last look at Salem's Crossing. The town was dead now, abandoned to the walking corpses that still shambled through its streets. But it had served its purpose. In losing everything, Michael had found that he'd been looking for all along. Not proof of God's existence. That had not really been in the question. But proof of God's presence, God's love, God's power to work through the imperfect human beings in the face of ultimate darkness. His crisis of faith was over. In its place was something stronger and more resilient. A faith tested by fire and found to be true. Whatever challenges lay ahead in this new world, Michael Brennan would face them, not as a man who had lost his way, but as one who had found it again in the most unlikely places. The last prayer had been answered after all. Epilogue. 5 years later, Father Michael Brennan stood before the altar of a makeshift chapel in the Springfield safe zone. The congregation was smaller than St. Augustine's had been, but it was growing. People needed faith in this new world, needed the hope that came from believing in something greater than the daily struggle for survival. He still carried Harold Wickham's prayer book, salvaged from the ruins of Salem's Crossings during a supply run 2 years ago. The old man's faith, simple and unquestioning, had become Michael's model. Not blind faith, but persistent faith. Faith that endured. Outside the safe zone's walls, the dead still walked. Scientists said they were close to a cure, but Michael had stopped putting his hope in human solutions alone. He'd learned that some problems required a different kind of answer. As he began the evening service, Michael's eyes found the faces of his congregation. Survivors all. People who had endured the unendurable, and still found reasons to hope. Among them sat Sarah Henderson, now working as a teacher in the Safe Zone school. Jerry had died in the second wave of infections, but Sarah and Chloe had survived, their faith intact. "We gather tonight," Michael began, "not to ask why darkness exists, but to kindle light against it, not to question God's plan, but to trust that even in the midst of chaos, that plan continues to unfold." His voice carried through the small space, steady and sure. The crisis of faith that had once threatened to destroy him now seemed like ancient history. He had been broken down and built back up again, refined in the fire of the apocalypse, and emerged stronger. The dead might inherit the earth, but the living still possessed something more powerful than hunger, more enduring than death itself. They possessed hope. They possessed love. They possessed faith. And sometimes, in a world gone mad, that was enough to work miracles. So I understand that this was a very faith-heavy story. Take it for what it is. It's a story about a priest, so obviously it's going to have a lot of elements of God and religion and things like that. But I think there's some good general things you can take from it regardless. You know, you can have faith in other things than God. You can have it in humanity. You can have it in yourself. You can have it in lots of things. Having the power of love and hope, I mean, that's a no-brainer. It's a pretty cliche story ending, but like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.